A new study released late last week by the U.S. National Transportation Board found that states that have legalized cannabis are seeing increases in car crashes compared to states where cannabis is not legal. Nearly 6 years ago, Colorado became the first state to legalize cannabis, and Koski was the state's marijuana enforcement director. Now that cannabis is legal here, what are some of the lessons learned from the Colorado experience? Joining me now from Sacramento, California, is Mr. Koski himself, who advises governments around the world on implementing cannabis policy. Mr. Koski, were you surprised at all by this study that showed the increase in car accidents after cannabis legalization?
Well, I'm not surprised at all to hear that the data is suggesting that there might be more car crashes. What we don't know is exactly what's causing that. It's not probably prudent to just assume right off the bat, just because a state's legalized cannabis and there's an increase in car accidents, that it's because of cannabis.
What did you see in Colorado in terms of impaired driving after legalization? Was there a significant spike initially?
So the best data that we have on that is data that's referred to as FARS data, and it's basically the fatal accident reporting data that we get every time a car accident occurs and someone is killed in those car accidents. They're tested for a number of different things, not the least of which is for the presence of cannabis. And so the most recent data in Colorado would suggest that there's an increase in cannabis after those tests. What we don't know for sure, though, is whether or not those people that tested positive for cannabis were impaired, because that test simply doesn't exist. And we don't know, therefore, whether or not it was the causation for those particular crashes. Certainly an area that we're concerned about, and it's certainly an area that government needs to be really sensitive to and continue to work through public education campaigns, improving regulations and those types of things to make sure that, that those problems, if they exist, are being addressed.
How do law enforcement officers deal with that? Because they have a breathalyzer for alcohol. We have a machine that tests in Canada called the Drygar 5000, but it's producing false positives below 4 degrees Celsius, which it is in a lot of Canada for a lot of the year. So how do police officers know if somebody is impaired?
Well, so I'm a law enforcement officer by trade, and so I'm familiar with this. You know, long before there was legalization, there were still cases that law enforcement brought forward with respect to impaired driving and the use of cannabis or multi-drug use, and certainly officers are trained on how to spot impairment, and most impairment cases involve first and foremost bad driving, so running a red light, speeding, swerving, those types of things, which cause the stop in the first place. And then officers are trained to be able to assess people who are driving for impairment and different types of impairment. And so they're still able to bring those types of cases forward and put those together and keep the roads safer, even though there's not a test for impairment.
What were the changes that you saw from a law enforcement perspective in the days and weeks and months after cannabis was initially legalized?
Well, I think, you know, we're seeing this play out across the country right now here in the U.S. and in Canada. There's a lot of work and effort that goes into the process of legalizing marijuana in any jurisdiction, and a lot of that work happens well in advance of the first day of legal sales, and then there's always a lot of work that has to be done afterwards as well. Some of the things that we were working on right after legalization was to continue to kind of complete the policy. So we had to work on regulations that address some of the concerns that we had about concentrate production and edibles, all of which have an impact on both public health and safety. We also were working really hard to be able to implement comprehensive testing regimes for the product itself. So our focus was really on the regulated community, how we can continue to evolve those regulations and really drive public health and safety while still also recognizing that this is a new industry that doesn't necessarily need to be crushed under the weight of really restrictive regulations.
How long did it take in Colorado before you started to see the legal industry actually starting to disrupt the black market?
Well, we think that there were some impacts relatively quickly with respect to the criminal market that was operating in Colorado. What we found, initially, was that the regulated market, once it really starts to come online and on-ramp into the framework, and you start to see inventory coming into an inventory tracking system, and you see that they're complying with a number of the regulations, they tend to shine a really bright light on those participants who are not coming forward and becoming part of the regulated industry. And so where there's this transition period where there's some gray area in terms of what's legal, what's not legal, once those regulated businesses really start coming online, becomes very apparent who is not operating in compliance with the law, which allows then law enforcement and state regulators, and in your case federal regulators, to really be able to identify who are the most risky actors and then dedicate resources towards those that are most likely to be creating the biggest public health and safety threats.
What advice would you give to Canada now? And I know this is what you do for a living. As we are in this post-legal era, what do we need to be thinking about up here?
Well, I have to say that it's going to be fascinating to watch how things develop up in Canada. And I think to a large extent, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of work that has to happen before statutes and regulations are fully enacted. And everything that we've seen so far up here, or up in Canada, would suggest that the country is really on the right track. You get a lot of support from elected and federal officials to make sure that you're getting this right. The country has done a really good job seeking the counsel of a lot of stakeholders, a very diverse group with differing opinions on how the regulations should be formulated. And so in a lot of ways, the things that have made Canada successful up until this point is going to continue to make them successful as they start to endeavor into regulating other products like concentrates and edibles.
Well, we have to wrap it up there, but Mr. Koski, thank you so much for your time and sharing your experience in Colorado with us.
It was my pleasure to be here. Have a nice weekend.